He had trained them. The rotation of the cohorts, the way the 10th Legion dressed to the right on broken ground. These were the methods Titus Labienus had refined, standing beside a younger man while the forests of Gaul burned around them. He had crossed the Rubicon in the other direction. He had gone to Pompey, and Pompey was dead. He had gone to Africa, and Africa was over. He had come here, to a hillside in Hispania, with what remained. On the morning of March 17, 45 BC, Labienus stood on the high ground and watched the Caesarian battle lines below. He recognized the formations. He knew exactly what they would do next. He knew because he had taught them. For decades, the name Julius Caesar commanded the battlefields of Europe, synonymous with brilliant outflanking maneuvers and unmatched tactical grace. But crossing the ocean to Hispania, he encountered an enemy entirely immune to his psychological warfare. Men who had already lost everything. Forced to fight uphill against gravity and despair, Caesar's seemingly invincible legions began to buckle under the terrifying pressure of pure attrition. Abandoning his horse and the safety of command, the master of Rome plunged into the chaotic front lines, weapon in hand, screaming at his faltering veterans. He survived the deadliest crucible of his life, not as a godlike strategist, but as a common legionary desperately hacking through the mud. Is the ultimate mark of a conqueror the ability to craft perfect strategies, or the raw, primal willingness to outbutcher the ghosts of the past? It lies buried in the very mud of Munda, the stage of his final campaign. A province bled dry. The Iberian sun beats down upon the plains of Hispania Baetica. It casts long, harsh shadows over a landscape destined to drink the blood of Rome's greatest sons. The civil war that has fractured the Roman world has dragged on for years, mutating from a political dispute into an inescapable cycle of retribution. Pompey was dead. Cato was dead. Scipio was dead. Petreius was dead. Afranius was dead. The men who had constituted the political identity of the Republican cause, the names that had given the resistance its claim to represent something beyond mere factional interest, had been killed in battle or had chosen death themselves in the 3 years since Pharsalus. The conflict in Africa has concluded. Pharnaces has suffered defeat. The surviving remnants of the opposition evacuated the continent, crossed the water, and relocated to further Spain. What remained in Hispania was the structure of opposition without most of its content. Gnaeus Pompeius the Younger, eldest son of the late Pompey the Great, assumed command of the displaced forces in the Iberian province. His immediate objective was not ideological, but financial. The accumulation of capital became the primary objective of the Pompeian high command. The loyalty of their troops depended upon regular distributions of silver. Pompeius initiated a systematic extraction of resources. He toured the provincial settlements, demanding provisions and manpower. When entreaties failed, he applied direct physical force. The province deteriorated under the sustained requisitioning. Some municipalities voluntarily transferred their grain and weapons. Others barricaded their gates and sealed their stone walls. When a walled town fell to an assault, the occupying officers inspected the municipal registries to identify the wealthiest citizens. Political affiliation held no relevance. A documented history of financial support for the Pompeian faction granted no immunity. Formal accusations were drafted, the wealthy residents executed, and their estates confiscated. The liquidated assets were distributed among the rank and file, generating a temporary surge in operational funding. They claimed to save the Republic, yet they destroyed the provinces to do so. Desperate, the targeted municipalities dispatched couriers across the continent to Italy, delivering formal requests for military intervention. Gaius Julius Caesar had remained in Italy, occupying his time with the exhibition of public games and the administration of the state. He held the office of dictator for the third consecutive term, and possessed the official designation for a fourth. Upon receiving the intelligence, he finalized his administrative obligations, departed the city, and traveled toward the western edge of the continent. The pace of his march exceeded all standard military projections. By December of 46 BC, Caesar arrives in Hispania Ulterior. The Caesarian advance column entered the province, where envoys from the city of Corduba intercepted the dictator on the road. Having recently defected from the Pompeian faction, they delivered vital tactical intelligence. Corduba remained vulnerable to a nocturnal assault, and Pompeius possessed no knowledge of Caesar's arrival. Caesarian patrols had systematically captured the Pompeian perimeter scouts and dispatch riders. Caesar forwarded written instructions to Quintus Pedius and Quintus Fabius Maximus, the lieutenants managing the vanguard, ordering them to mobilize the provincial cavalry. But moving ahead of schedule, Caesar arrived at the forward encampments before the cavalry had assembled. This forced him to operate with limited mounted support. The storm and the siege. The theater of operations was fundamentally divided. Sextus Pompeius maintained a fortified position inside Corduba, the administrative capital. Meanwhile, his brother Cineas directed a prolonged siege against the town of Iulia, an investment that had lasted for several months. The winter months of early 45 BC were defined by these grueling, attritional sieges at settlements like Ategua and Eucuba. The conflict had lost whatever ideological purity it once possessed. There was no longer a clear division between the defenders of the Republic and the champions of the people. The battlefields were dominated by the veterani, professionalized infantrymen. Yet this term carried a dark ambiguity. These were hardened killers, men who had mutinied, switched sides, and broken oaths. They knew surrender equated to execution. The residents of Iulia possessed a long-standing record of alignment with the Roman people. The defenders of Iulia registered the dictator's arrival, and dispatched agents through the Pompeian encirclement to request immediate reinforcement. Caesar authorized the intervention. At the second watch of the night, approximately the 9th hour, he detached 11 cohorts of heavy infantry and an equal number of cavalry squadrons. They were placed under the command of Lucius Julius Paciscus, a man with extensive topographical knowledge of the region. As the detachment marched toward Iulia, a severe meteorological event intersected with their advance. A violent tempest broke over the terrain, sweeping a blinding wind across the operational zone. It prevented a soldier from visually identifying the man marching directly beside him. Paciscus utilized the storm. Ordering the infantry to halt, he directed the cavalry to form into columns of 2 and advance directly into the enemy encampment. The howling wind masked the acoustic signature of the hooves. When a Pompeian sentry detected the movement and demanded identification, a Caesarian trooper verbally instructed him to remain silent. The trooper claimed they were moving into position to initiate an escalade against the walls of the town. The sentry accepted the pretext. The column passed through the center of the hostile camp, reaching the gates of Julia. The prearranged signal was given, the iron hinges turned, and the Caesarian cohorts crossed the threshold. As the infantry secured the interior, the cavalry wheeled their mounts and charged out of the gates. They drove their weapons into the rear of the Pompeian siege lines. The sudden auditory shock and physical impact shattered the cohesion of the besiegers. At Ategua, Pompeius's strongest garrisoned stronghold, Caesar surrounded the town with siegeworks and fortified lines. The town fell on February 19, 45 BC. Before it fell, the Pompeian garrison commander inside had done something that the Bellum Hispaniense also records. When desertions and surrender discussions began among the population, the commander took those suspected of wanting to surrender and killed them, along with their families, on the walls. The envoys Caesar sent to the town of Ursau, Roman knights and senators among them, met the same outcome. 2 men escaped and reported to Caesar what had happened to the rest. These events are not tactical data. They are measurements of what the war had cost the men fighting it on the Pompeian side. When the tools available to a garrison commander for maintaining unit cohesion are the public execution of suspected defectors and their families, the army doing this has gone past the point where terms like strategy or morale carry their normal meaning. The conflict then mutated into a war of positional attrition. The town of Vintipo fell to a Caesarian assault. Recognizing the shifting tactical momentum, Cnaeus Pompeius ordered a withdrawal. Before abandoning Caruca, he commanded his personnel to apply torches to the structures. The buildings burned to their foundations, smoke blackening the sky as the Pompeian army marched south. After Ategua, Gnaeus Pompeius had no choice remaining. Desertions were taking the army apart. The strongholds were falling. The Bellum Hispaniense records that it was desertions that forced Gnaeus Pompeius to give battle. The geometry of a standstill. Caesar tracked the withdrawal until the pursuit ended near the town of Munda. It was the 17th of March, 45 BC, the feast of Bacchus. On the previous day, March 16, the Pompeian forces had secured a decisive topographical advantage. Munda occupied the summit of a steep elevation. A declining slope stretched downward from the defensive walls, terminating in a flat valley. A plain extended across the base, cut by a continuous rivulet that saturated the adjacent earth. On the right flank of the plain, the water pooled into a stagnant morass, a mud pit deep enough to swallow armored infantry. The approach from the right was physically compromised. On the elevation of Munda, 35,000 men waited in deep masses. They were a fractured opposition. The Bellum Hispaniense, the eyewitness account written by one of Caesar's officers in the campaign, records the composition of these forces. Of the 13 legions, the author counted 4 with any real fighting value. The rest, the text records, were made up of runaways and auxiliaries. They had drawn levies from Ategua, Urso, Tuches, Julia, and Agua. They were cornered men fighting with nothing left to lose. They had been stripped of their estates, their titles, and their dignity. Among their commanders stood Titus Labienus. Labienus was not a stranger. He had been a tribune of the people. He had been Caesar's most trusted lieutenant in the Gallic campaigns. He had constructed the very tactical doctrines the Caesarians now utilized. He had served as Caesar's senior legate through the Gallic Wars, from 58 to 49 BC, 8 years in the field. He spent those 8 years executing the tactics that Caesar designed, managing the logistics that Caesar planned. He commanded the left wing or the holding force or the rear guard, while Caesar operated elsewhere. He was older than Caesar, and more experienced in some respects. The army that eventually crossed the Rhine twice and stormed the fortifications at Alesia was in significant part an army that Labienus had trained, fed, moved, and led. When Caesar crossed the Rubicon in January 49 BC with the 13th Legion and started a civil war, Labienus crossed in the other direction. He told Caesar by letter that he was not going to be part of whatever came next, and he went to Pompey. He knew Caesar's tactical mind from inside. He knew how Caesar advanced, how he feinted, how he used cavalry, how he adapted to terrain. He had been Caesar's instrument of surprise for 8 years. He knew the rotation of the enemy cohorts. He knew the signals of the centurions. Labienus anchored his defense on the steep topography. He positioned his desperate infantry where the sharp incline would force the Caesarian war machine to fight gravity before it ever touched a shield. The Pompeians stripped away all pretense of noble civil war. They dug in. They waited. Below them, the Caesarian camp operated with the terrifying precision of a ledger. Before a single weapon was drawn, the legionaries mutilated the earth. They dug the fossa, hurling the dirt inward to pack the agar. The perimeter was measured. 2 main streets intersected the enclosure at precise right angles. The Via Principalis terminated at the Porta Principalis Dextra and the Sinistra. The Via Praetoria led directly to the Porta Decumana. Within this rigid wooden grid, the tabernacula were pitched in identical rows. Inside the tents, 10 men formed a contubernium. They sharpened iron. They inspected leather straps. They remained silent. The decanus checked the armor. The tribuni militum recorded the grain distributions. Scribes dipped reeds into ink pots, updating the tallies of provisions. Outside the gates, the logistics of the slaughter proceeded without emotion. On the morning of the 17th, the landscape was poised for slaughter. Caesar deployed his smaller but highly experienced army of 8 legions and 8,000 cavalry on the plain. He expected a symmetrical engagement, that the massive Pompeian force of 13 legions and 6,000 cavalry would march down the slope, cross the rivulet, and meet his shields on the flat earth. But the Pompeians remained stationary. They aligned their cohorts on the high ground, standing shoulder to shoulder, looking down at the valley. Their front rank stood less than 1 mile from the stone walls of Munda. In standard Roman military doctrine, attacking a fortified enemy on an elevated position is a devastating miscalculation. The standoff stretches on, a psychological war of nerves, until Caesar, perhaps driven by the tightening vice of logistics or the sheer pressure of the campaign, gives the order to advance. The legions crossed the plain, reaching the edge of the rivulet. The incline of the mountain began. The morass bordered their right flank. The tactical disadvantage materialized instantly. To engage, the Caesarian infantry would have to march upward against gravity, navigating saturated ground. Evaluating the physics of the terrain, Caesar issued the order to halt. The forward momentum died. The centurions dressed the lines, and the soldiers planted their scuta in the dirt. A low murmur originated from the rear ranks, propagating through the formations. The men articulated their dissatisfaction, perceiving the halt as an obstruction to a guaranteed outcome. They demanded the order to attack, standing in the valley, staring at the slope. Observing this cessation of movement, the Pompeian officers evaluated the Caesarian halt as a mechanical failure of will, a strategic manifestation of fear. They issued a command to advance. The Pompeian front line stepped forward, moving a short distance down the incline, but they stopped. They did not abandon the elevation. The slope between the two armies remained steep. The architecture of the Caesarian war machine locked into place. Caesar established his right wing, positioning his favored veterans of the 10th Legion, Legio X Equestris, at the extreme right, their combat record overriding their reduced numerical strength. He deployed the 3rd and 5th Legions to anchor the left flank, distributing auxiliary cohorts and cavalry along the perimeter. The geometry of the battle lines achieved finality. The meat grinder. The silence broke. A single synchronized shout tore out of the throats of the Caesarian infantry. The Pompeians answered with a corresponding roar, the acoustic impact equalizing across the valley. The physical exchange commenced. Archers released their strings. Skirmishers hurled their darts. The sky filled with a kinetic mass of wood and iron crossing the vertical divide. Iron tips struck bronze helmets, punched through wooden shields, and penetrated chainmail. The plain and the slope disappeared beneath accumulating debris. The front ranks absorbed the initial velocity of the barrage, bodies collapsing into the mud. Then, the heavy infantry engaged. The gap closed. The lines collided on the incline. The historian Cassius Dio describes a battlefield where all semblance of tactical elegance completely collapsed. There were no brilliant outflanking maneuvers here, no complex stratagems or feats of engineering that had characterized Caesar's legendary siege of Alesia or his triumph at Pharsalus. The combat compressed into absolute proximity. Soldiers fought hand to hand, foot to foot, shield to shield. The iron bosses of the scuta slammed into opposing wood. Short swords thrust upward and downward through narrow gaps. The men on the slope utilized the weight of the elevation. The men in the valley drove their boots into the dirt and pushed upward. Blood lubricated the grass. The slaughter mechanized. This was an attritional struggle decided purely by the endurance of the veterani. The sheer exhaustion and mechanical ruthlessness of Caesar's veteran war machine were matched, strike for strike, by the desperate resolve of the Pompeian infantry. For hours, the physical combat was maintained at a bloody standstill. The Iberian plains were transformed into an agonizing purgatory of clashing metal, shattering wood, and the screams of dying men. The crisis reached such an extreme, terrifying pitch that the chain of command itself began to disintegrate. The Caesarian lines began to buckle under the overwhelming pressure. The momentum of the uphill assault had died, and the sheer weight of the Pompeian defense threatened to push his army back into a catastrophic rout. Seeing his men faltering, Caesar realized his legendary fortune was on the verge of expiring. In a moment of profound vulnerability that stripped away all the grandeur of the general, Caesar physically dismounted his horse. He abandoned the customary distance of a commanding officer and seized a shield. He hurled himself directly into the chaotic front lines alongside the 10th Legion on the right wing. Fighting face to face in the mud and the blood, shouting to his men, he engaged in a primal struggle to prevent the total collapse of his army. The master of Rome was reduced to a common legionary, fighting tooth and nail against the relentless tide of Pompeian iron. The legionaries had no choice but to fight, not for the Republic, but for this single man. As Plutarch would later record, Caesar confessed to his inner circle that in all his previous engagements across Gaul, Greece, and Egypt, he had fought for victory. But at Munda, for the very first time, he fought for his life. Caesar, the seemingly invincible conqueror, was forced to face the ghosts of his past, the cornered, nihilistic remnants of the Pompeian faction. Commanded by the sons of Pompey the Great, these men fought with the terrifying, unyielding ferocity of soldiers who possessed absolutely nothing left to lose. The fatal maneuver. Late in the afternoon, the deadlock was finally broken. On the right wing, the 10th Legion initiated a concentrated forward push. The veterans locked their shields, stepped into the gradient, and drove their iron into the Pompeian left wing. The structural integrity of the Pompeian left began to fail, the line bowing backward as the men of the 10th advanced over the bodies of the dead, pressing the opposing cohorts up the mountain. Calculating the trajectory of this localized collapse, the Pompeian High Command issued a corrective directive. They detached a full legion from their own unengaged right wing. They marched this unit across the rear of their battle line to insert into the crumbling left flank, utilizing their mass to halt the 10th. But this lateral redeployment fundamentally altered the structural balance. The removal of the legion created a kinetic void on the Pompeian right. The Caesarian left wing, the 3rd and 5th Legions, capitalized on the deficit. They increased their forward pressure, driving their shields into the weakened Pompeian right. The hand-to-hand parity disintegrated. Simultaneously, an opportunistic maneuver completely bypassed the infantry meat grinder. King Bagud of Mauritania, commanding the light allied cavalry attached to Caesar's forces, recognized the futility of a frontal charge. Acting on instinct, he led his horsemen in a sweeping arc, launching a sudden and vicious assault on the Pompeian rear camp. Observing this unexpected threat to their lifeline, Titus Labienus, once Caesar's most brilliant lieutenant in Gaul, now his most capable enemy, made a fateful decision. He detached 5 cohorts of cavalry from the Pompeian lines, ordering them to wheel around and intercept Bagud's raiders. Here, in the dust and confusion of the turning tide, the historical record fractures, forcing us to confront the fundamental unreliability of ancient chronicles. Appian suggests Labienus's movement was a purely tactical redeployment, a calculated necessity to defend the camp. Cassius Dio implies it was a direct retreat, a recognition that the battle was lost. The anonymous author of the official Caesarian log, the De Bello Hispaniense, frames the enemy's actions through a lens of obstinacy and eventual cowardice. Modern historians note the linguistic ambiguities in the surviving texts. The Greek terminology blurs the lines between a tactical fallback and a fleeing rout. But the intention of Titus Labienus ultimately ceases to matter. What matters is what the exhausted, blood-soaked Pompeian infantry saw. Locked in the trauma of close-quarters combat, fighting for their lives, the Pompeian rank and file looked back. They observed the sudden backward movement of their own elite cavalry. They did not see a tactical redeployment. They saw abandonment. The sociological clash snapped in an instant. In a war fought by desperate men who knew defeat meant death, the psychological thread broke. Panic, highly contagious and utterly lethal, swept through the ranks. The line fractured. The soldiers abandoned their forward engagement, turned their backs, and desperately attempted to flee up the mountain toward the stone walls of Munda, seeking the shelter of the fortifications from which they had deployed hours earlier. A biological architecture. What followed was not a military victory, but a merciless extermination. The discipline of the Roman legion gave way to sequential eradication. The Caesarian infantry pursued the fleeing men up the slope. Short swords severed hamstrings. Blades penetrated exposed backs. The brilliant Titus Labienus, the architect of much of the Pompeian resistance and a man who knew Caesar's mind better than anyone, was killed in the chaotic slaughter, his body left to the Iberian dust. The physical exertion terminated at the gates of the town. As the sun moved toward the horizon and the feast of Bacchus concluded, the counting of the dead began. Bodies lay distributed across the mountain, the slope, the rivulet, and the plain. The anonymous author of the official Caesarian log, the De Bello Hispaniense, attributed to Aulus Hirtius, provides a staggering, stomach-churning casualty report. The ancient sources claim 30,000 Pompeian soldiers lay dead, compared to a mere 1,000 Caesarians, with 500 wounded. The bureaucratic segregation of the deceased commenced. Among the 30,000 corpses, scribes identified 3,000 Roman knights, their origins documented on wax tablets. A portion originated from the Italian peninsula. A portion originated from the provincial territories. Retrieval units located the bodies of Titus Labienus and Attius Verus, the two senior commanders. Labienus, he was the man who knew Caesar's mind better than anyone, who had executed Caesar's orders through 8 years of Gallic campaigning. He had taken those skills across the Rubicon in the other direction. He was the architect of much of the Pompeian resistance and had been at Dyrrhachium and Pharsalus and Thapsus. He had kept coming back because the cause required it, or because there was nowhere else to go. He died on March 17, 45 BC, in a province he knew from the Sertorian Wars, fighting against an army he had helped create. Logistical personnel gathered wood and constructed pyres. The funeral obsequies were executed directly upon the field of battle, the fire consuming their remains while clerks continued to count. 13 legionary eagles were extracted from the grip of the dead, alongside several standard poles. Every standard of the Pompeian legions captured. 17 Pompeian officers who survived the slaughter were stripped of their weapons and registered as prisoners of war. Yet, we must view these numbers with intense skepticism. Modern military historiography suggests Caesar's losses were deliberately suppressed for political consumption back in Rome. Conversely, the massive Pompeian death toll of 30,000 likely includes the systematic, mass executions of prisoners and civilians that occurred after the battle ended. A massacre of Roman citizens by Roman citizens. The physical aftermath of Munda leaves a dark stain on the history of Roman engineering. In the weeks that followed, Caesar's forces laid siege to the remnants inside Munda. Caesar abstained from his usual clementia, and the victors and their allies vented all their bitterness on the two cities. This was not the Caesar of Pharsalus, who had released prisoners and absorbed defeated officers into his own command. Fighting merely to survive, Caesar had no time for clementia. He had no mercy left for those who had repeatedly rejected his pardons and fled. Munda was too far from Rome, where an audience of senators and citizens sat. Caesar no longer had any reason to wear the mask of clementia. To construct their siege works, the vallum and agger, they did not use timber and earth. The De Bello Hispaniense records, with bureaucratic detachment, that the Caesarian soldiers built their palisades using the severed heads and corpses of the deceased Pompeian soldiers, pinning them together with captured javelins. Gnaeus Pompeius managed to escape the immediate bloodbath, fleeing into the harsh countryside, but his reprieve was brief. Hunted down without mercy, he was captured and executed less than a month later, on the 12th of April, in the town of Loro. His severed head was later displayed to the public in the city of Hispalis. Defending the Republic was far too cruel a fate for this family. The father in Africa, the son in Spain. Sextus Pompeius escaped into continued resistance and survived for another 10 years, until 36 BC. Caesar remained in Spain until late September 45 BC. He returned to Rome and prepared the triumph. It was celebrated at the beginning of October. It was unpopular in a way that his previous triumphs, which had produced groans and then exultation in the same crowd on the same day, had not been. Plutarch records the city's response directly. The triumph displeased the Romans beyond anything. For he had not defeated foreign generals or barbarian kings, but had destroyed the children and family of one of the greatest men of Rome. Canphora observes that to celebrate a triumph over Roman citizens was an unheard of act. The Battle of Munda was entirely devoid of the honor, pageantry, and strategic elegance that once characterized early Roman warfare. It marks the true end of the Roman civil wars, but it offers no catharsis. Stripped of the political pretense of saving the Republic, it stands as a testament to the brutal reality of power. Caesar survived the deadliest crucible of his entire military career, not through a masterstroke of genius, but through the grim, exhausted ruthlessness of his veterans, his own willingness to bleed in the dirt, and a tragic failure of communication within the enemy ranks. The war machine processed the data. The scribes closed their wax tablets. The continent was secured. The Roman Republic died, not with a poetic speech in the Senate, but suffocating on a Spanish hillside, buried beneath a wall of its own dead. The clerks wrote down the numbers. The eagle standards were counted. The official log recorded Labienus once, body identified, funeral rites performed on site. What they did not write down was the particular way he had taught. Caesar's men still used it that afternoon. They used it walking uphill. The direction did not survive him.